The Consumer Price Index, or CPI. What is it? How does it work? How does it relate to inflation? And what does it allow us to learn about the global economy? Up next, we're going to dig into the International Monetary Fund's CPI data and see what it has to tell us. Let's imagine that you are the president of a country, unless of course you are actually the president of a country, in which case obviously no imagination is required. How do you know what's going on with your economy? Is it doing well? Is it doing badly? All might seem okay. Goods and services are being bought and sold, banks have money, people aren't complaining too much. But is the economy better than it was last year or the year before? Is it worse? If the economy is in worse shape than last year, we need to take steps to halt that decline. But if it's better, we could take advantage of that and lend more money out at a lower rate to encourage the economy to grow. And if the cost of living is higher, we're going to have more people in poverty, so we'll need more provision for social services, healthcare, crime prevention. But if the cost of living has gone down, well, we can cut spending in those areas. It was conversations like these that led to the introduction of large-scale financial metrics, the Consumer Price Index being one of the most significant and widely used of these. The CPI aims to measure the cost of living across a society and the increases and decreases to that cost of living over time. To do this, it takes an imagined basket of goods and services, gives a weighting to each item depending on how often it's purchased, and tracks the cost of this basket over time. These goods and services are representative of what's being bought by the people in the population being measured. So, doing nothing to subvert any national stereotypes, the Italian basket includes scooter insurance, the British includes beef roasting joints, and the French includes prostitution. Well, it is something that people pay for that increases or decreases in cost over time. Obviously, the contents of baskets will also change over time as different goods and services become popular or lose popularity. Smartwatches and GoPros are a lot more popular now than they were in 1980, whereas these days there aren't many people buying coal or home perm outfits. Yep, me neither. They're in the 1980 UK CPI basket. A lot of home perms going on in the early 80s. It's interesting to note vinyl records. They left most national CPI baskets in the 80s, but are now returning due to an unprecedented uptick in sales, now actually outselling CDs in the US. The way CPI is expressed is as a percentage change versus the previous year, quarter or month. This is often called consumer price inflation or just inflation. And this information is used to adjust everything from wages to state benefits to rents. So, taking vinyl records as an example, if the Best of Jim Neighbours cost 10, let's say, euro to buy in December 2019, and inflation over the next 12 months was 3%, then the same record would have cost €10.30 in December 2020. The ideal inflation rate is generally considered to be around 2%. This low inflation rate is generally considered good because it indicates that an economy is stable, meaning that saving and investment are desirable, leading to economic growth. Deflation, though, where consumer prices decrease over time, is not necessarily a good thing, as it can indicate a shrinking economy. Of course, the CPI does have its limitations. Firstly, there is substitution bias. This is where the basket of goods remains fixed, but consumers start to buy a different, better value item that is not on the list. For example, if canned pet food is included in the CPI basket, but the price for it starts rising, consumers may decide to start buying cheaper dry pet food. Because canned pet food is in the CPI basket and its price has gone up, it will cause the CPI to show an increase in consumer spending on pet food when consumers are in fact spending less. This also relates to the second limitation, representation of novelty. This is a distortion of the CPI that occurs when new disruptive products or services come to market. Because an item has to be selling in quantity over a period of time before it's added to the CPI basket, a situation can occur where something that attracts significant consumer spending has not yet made it into the basket. A good example of this is hand sanitizer and face masks. On a side note, is a face mask not a tautology? I mean, there are no elbow masks or foot masks. Anyway, hand sanitizer and masks became very regularly purchased items during the pandemic, but there was a lag before they were included in the CPI basket. The Consumer Price Index also has issues with changes to the quality of items in the basket. It can't account for the quality of an item increasing or decreasing, and therefore actually being more or less valuable to the consumer. As an example, a car manufacturer may release an updated model. It might just be the same as last year's model, but with a few improvements. Better fuel economy, or a better trim level, or racing stripes, say. But the manufacturer may keep the price the same as in the previous year. So this updated model is higher quality than it was last year, in that the consumer is getting a better car for the money. But, as far as the CPI is concerned, there has been no change from the previous year. The final major problem that the CPI has is with how it relates to the individual. Because the baskets used are representative of a large population, they may not apply in large part to a given individual. If the price of a car goes up, even if it does now have racing stripes, this doesn't affect someone who doesn't drive. In the same way, an increase in the price of beef means that a meat eater experiences price inflation, but a vegetarian doesn't. Okay, so let's take a look at the data. What you're seeing here is CPI data from 1980 to 2020. The darker the colour of green, the lower the inflation rate is. The darker the colour of orange, the higher the inflation rate is. As it's the world's biggest economy, let's start with the United States. You might notice that the US inflation rate was very high in 1980, 13.55% at year end. But as the 80s progress on, it decreases, but is still volatile. It stabilises in the 90s at the desirable level of around 2% and stays there until the global financial crisis hits in 2008. Canada, Western Europe and Australasia have also been in mostly relatively low and stable inflationary states since the mid-90s, whereas the rest of the world has been ping-ponging up and down. This is of course with the exception of the global financial crisis of 2008, the effect of which can be seen here. This is the global inflation data, and we can see that, averaged across the world, inflation peaked at 9% in 2008. Also note that Japan has had low inflation and even prolonged periods of deflation for most of the same period. This has not generally been a good thing, with the period from 1991 to 2001 coming to be known as Japan's lost decade. During this time, while other advanced economies were growing at a healthy rate, Japan's economy just barely increased in size from one year to the next, or even shrank. Deflation is a major issue in Japan to this day. You may have noticed that there is no data for Russia or most of its surrounding countries before 1990. And by the time they've all appeared, they're all suffering from catastrophically high inflation, along with much of Central Europe. You've probably guessed that this is the result of the breakup of the Soviet Union, a process which ended in 1991. Here's the CPI inflation rate for Russia from 1993 to the present day. But Russia never experienced hyperinflation, which is generally defined as out-of-control inflation peaking at over 1,000%. Famously, this situation occurred in Zimbabwe in 2008. As a result of the government printing more money to deal with rising national debt and a decline in economic output, among many other factors. Annual inflation rose to an estimated 200 billion%, estimated because the government stopped publishing data, thus rendering the Zimbabwean dollar worthless. As an illustration, in 1980, when the Zimbabwean dollar was introduced, it had a 1-to-1 exchange rate with the US dollar, meaning $1 cost one Zimbabwean dollar to buy. At the end of 2008, $1 cost something around 66.9 sextillion of the 1980 Zimbabwe dollars. A sextillion is 1 followed by 21 zeros. Subsequent to this, the Zimbabwe dollar was abandoned, and currencies from other countries, including the US dollar, have been used in its place. In recent times, the country that has experienced the worst hyperinflation is Venezuela. Although several countries in South America have also had hyperinflation issues, the sustained nature of Venezuela's makes it more severe. As you can see, according to IMF estimates, since 1998 inflation has been very high, with it increasing to hyperinflation levels in 2018. This hyperinflation has been blamed on many factors, but chiefly on the government's deficit spending combined with the printing of large amounts of money. Of course, another common contributing factor to the dire economic straits in which both Zimbabwe and Venezuela found themselves is the high levels of corruption present in both governments. Which brings us to the present day. I'm sure that you're curious as to the current best and worst economies. Well, this is the rundown from the IMF data for CPI inflation rates for the 12 months to the end of June 2021. Note that if there is no data for June 2021, this is the most recent available data, as long as CPI has been reported since June 2019. So, no Venezuela. They gave up on reporting CPI some time before that. Let's begin with the countries with the highest rates of CPI inflation. At the top, we see Sudan, currently suffering due to having run up huge budget deficits subsidising the cost of fuel, printing money to cover this, and consequently devaluing the currency as a result. Second on the list, we find Lebanon, which, as you may remember, endured a catastrophic chemical explosion in the port of its capital city, Beirut, in August of 2020. Their economic situation wasn't good prior to this due to government corruption, along with the borrowing of money at above market rates to pay back government debts. The explosion at the port of Beirut, along with the pandemic, only served to make a bad situation much worse, with the World Bank currently estimating that more than half the population of Lebanon are now living below the poverty line. Now, taking a look at the most deflationary economies, we can see that most of the top 10 are small states, where deflation has resulted from shrinking economies due to the pandemic. Lower wages leading to lower demand from consumers, leading to business cutting prices. The two exceptions to this small state rule are the Persian Gulf states of Bahrain and Oman, whose economies are deflating due to the pandemic and also a downsizing in oil production, both of which have caused job losses, the consequent departure of foreign workers causing a collapse in consumer demand. And so to the best performing economies. These are the 10 best economies based on their CPI inflation rate being the closest, above or below, to the optimal 2% rate. As we can see, the current champions of CPI inflation are the Netherlands, with other strong Northern European economies, Finland, Luxembourg and Denmark, also appearing. More surprisingly, perhaps, is the presence of the smaller developing economies of Cameroon, Costa Rica, North Macedonia, Cambodia and Mauritania. These countries all have good, stable, steadily growing economies, with the exception of Cameroon, which has suffered greatly due to the pandemic, falling oil prices, as well as its poor security situation. However, the country has had its economy propped up by the Central Bank of Central African States, leading to impacts being mitigated. So, I hope that you've enjoyed this quick tour through the IMF CPI data. Raw data and sources are available in the description. I'm looking to put up a video a week digging into a different data set each time, so please check back for the next one soon.